Hey everyone, in the last video I talked a lot about progressivism and things going on inside the country, but today we're going to focus on imperialism and foreign policy, so the way the United States was dealing with issues outside the country. Just remember that imperialism and progressivism do occur at the same time, so just keep that in mind as we go throughout this video. Okay, let's start with why the US was so late to getting involved in imperialism. If you remember from your studies in AP Euro or world history, you should remember that the European powers were already spreading their influence around the world and gaining new territories like places in Africa or Asia, and they had already set up colonies in Latin America. But the United States, for the most part, stayed out of these things. The first reason was they were still very anti-colonial for a long time. Remember, the United States used to be a colony themselves, and then they overthrew the British because they hated being a colony so much. So for a long time, they didn't want to do that to anyone else, although obviously this changes later on. The next reason is that they had a frontier region to expand to for a long time. They didn't need to go overseas looking for colonies because they had perfectly good land right next to them. And the last reason they were so late in seeking resources abroad was that they were dealing with issues in their own country like the Civil War. And then after that, they had to fix all of these issues during Reconstruction. So they didn't have a lot of time or the military power to send people overseas to capture new territories. But all of that changed in 1890. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a thesis titled The Significance of the Frontier on American History. He talks about how the frontier, or the unsettled land, was more than just a place for Americans. It represented opportunity. They didn't need to find resources or new land overseas. They had it right next to them this whole time. Until 1890, when the frontier closed, meaning Americans had already taken over everything available to them from the East Coast to the West Coast. So now they have to look overseas for new frontier and new resources. Another reason Americans got involved in imperialism in the 1890s was because they needed new places to sell all of their stuff that they were making because of the changes during the Industrial Revolution. And during this time, a book written by Captain Alfred Mahan became popular. It was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And during this time, a book written by Captain Alfred Mahan became popular. It was called The Influence of the Sea Power Upon History. He argued that control of the sea was key to world dominance. This encouraged Americans to begin demanding a better navy. They especially wanted a larger navy to protect all the new ships that were shipping products they made and selling them in other countries. And once they have a bigger navy, then they realize they need a place for them to stop and get more fuel. This is another thing that led to a desire for colonies, so the ships could have a place to stop and fuel up. Rudyard Kipling was a British poet who shared some of his ideas with Roosevelt before they were officially published. One was super influential on Roosevelt, which was titled The White Man's Burden. It said, "Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness." The idea was that wealthy Americans should help the underprivileged and underfed of the world. So basically spread their ideas of democracy. But this often led to just flat exploiting or using them instead. Others, like Josiah Strong, tried to argue that imperialism was important because it was important for them to spread their religion and values to backward peoples. Then in 1898, the United States gets in their first war during the time of imperialism. At the time, Cuba was a colony of Spain, and some Cubans began to lead an uprising against the Spanish and began to burn sugar fields, which were the main source of income there for Spain. Well, the Spanish did not like this, so they sent in a dude named Weyler. He was nicknamed the Butcher, so you can imagine how nice he is. Well, he began to put Cubans who revolted in reconcentration camps, and they were super unsanitary, and people were dying like crazy. The U.S. was concerned about this, but also about Americans who lived and worked there. They had businesses that were making about $50 to $100 million a year there as well. So they sent the battleship, the USS Maine, to Cuba for a friendly visit. It was mostly there to help Americans get to safety if they needed to. Well, it mysteriously explodes, and Americans immediately blame the Spanish. Even though we know now that evidence says it was an accident, the American people began to demand war. And they especially want war after two things happen. First, the newspapers under William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were both competing at the time to see who could sell the most newspapers. So they began printing really exaggerated, or in some cases made up stories and pictures so people would buy their paper. For example, they printed a picture of Spanish officials in Cuba stripping an American woman naked and brutally searching her just because she wanted to visit Cuba. This was all very exaggerated, but you can imagine how it would sell newspapers, kind of like our clickbait of today. And then when the USS Maine explodes, they printed exaggerated images of men flying high into the air and sayings like, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And those all became popular. And Hearst also printed a secret letter from the Spanish minister who was in Washington, D.C. The letter said some things about President McKinley that weren't very flattering. The people were outraged that someone would talk about their own president like that, and because of all of these things combined, they wanted war. So the U.S. does go to war with Spain. Other than just these issues, they also wanted to control Cuba. At the beginning of the war, they declared the Teller Amendment that said they would give Cubans their freedom, something that is kind of overturned later. The U.S. does leave Cuba in 1902 and give them their freedom, but they forced them to include the Platt Amendment in their constitution, which said they couldn't agree to any treaties without the U.S. approving them first. They couldn't take any debt unless the U.S. said it was okay. They had to sell the U.S. some of their land so the U.S. could create a naval base, and the U.S. military was allowed to intervene if they felt they needed to restore order. The Cubans hated this, and even today, Cubans talk about Plattism like it is a disgusting thing. But they had no choice, so the U.S. gave them their freedom, in quotation marks, but also gained control like they wanted. The Spanish-American War was a really quick war and was won pretty easily by the United States. The Secretary of State, John Hay, actually called it a splendid little war because it was really quick and because most Americans were supportive of the war and really patriotic about it at the time. At the end of the war, the United States gained new colonies like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Filipinos thought the U.S. was going to give them freedom like they did in Cuba, but the U.S. felt differently. Some, like Roosevelt, argued that if you give the Philippines to the Filipinos, then you would have to give Arizona to the Apaches, which Americans clearly weren't going to do. McKinley felt that if he gave freedom to the Filipinos, then some other country would just come in and take over since it was so far from the U.S. to protect, unlike Cuba. And they had a desire to go in and Christianize the natives, so the United States decides to colonize rather than give them their independence. But the Filipinos didn't give in to U.S. control easily. Instead, they fought back, which was called the Philippine Insurrection, and the U.S. was eventually able to stop their rebellion, but it ended with 4,234 American deaths and over 600,000 Filipinos dying. Afterwards, Americans tried to Americanize the Filipinos by providing schools that taught English and American values. The U.S. finally does give Filipinos their independence in 1946, so after World War II. The war also brought about the insular cases. Some people in Puerto Rico petitioned Congress asking if they have the same rights as Americans, and the Supreme Court decided in the insular cases that the Constitution doesn't follow the flag, meaning that they might be under American rule, but that doesn't mean they are guaranteed the same rights as Americans. So if we go back to the beginning of the video where we talked about how presidents like Roosevelt wanted to spread these ideas of democracy, this is not becoming quite true. These ideas and guarantees of freedom in the Constitution are not guaranteed to the places that they colonize. Okay, let's take a look at Hawaii now. Before the Spanish-American War, there were already several sugar plantation owners who were American that were living in Hawaii. And then the United States passed a tariff that made it harder for them to sell sugar in the United States. So they wanted to annex Hawaii or make the Hawaii part of the United States so they didn't have to pay this tax. They led an uprising in 1893 against the Queen, and even the U.S. troops that were stationed there helped. But they were not supposed to. They had no authorization to help. And then finally, they asked Congress to make Hawaii a new state. At the time, President Cleveland refused, but in 1898, Hawaii annexation is accepted. In China, the European powers like Russia, Germany, and Great Britain had began to create specific treaties with China so they could sell their products there. The US was afraid that they would be left out and not be able to sell any of their goods in China, so the Secretary of State, John Jay, came up with the idea called the open door policy. He sent a note to the European powers and told them they should announce that in their spheres of influence, so the places where they were controlling the economies in China, they would respect China's rights and also allow fair competition. Basically, they wanted them to say the US could trade there too. But he didn't bother to ask the Chinese how they felt about this. And it turns out there were several Chinese people who hated having these foreigners in their country. In 1900, a group of patriotic Chinese, nicknamed Boxers because of their training in martial arts, murdered more than 200 foreigners and thousands of Chinese Christians. A combined force that had some Americans were able to stop this, but it gave the European powers and the US more control in China and led to more westernization of Asia. The last thing I want to discuss is that not all Americans supported these causes. People like Mark Twain, who I'm sure you've heard of before, spoke out against imperialism and even formed organizations to protest against this. The biggest one was the Anti-Imperialist League. It was supported by presidents from Harvard and Stanford, and even people like Samuel Gompers and Andrew Carnegie were involved. They argued that imperialism went against the philosophies that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution supported. So imperialism does a lot of bad things around the world, but there are people in the United States who are speaking out against this. Okay, your practice question for today is another practice LEQ question, and this one is evaluate the extent to which international conflicts in the period from 1898 to 1930 affected the role of the United States in the world. Pause the video here, think about how you would respond to this question, maybe write down a couple pieces of evidence, and then check out the possible evidence and context in the video's description below. Okay, today's practice question is a practice long essay question. It is evaluate the extent to which international conflicts in the period from 1898 to 1930 affected the role of the United States in the world. Pause the video here, think about what your context would be, think about what kind of evidence you would use, what would your thesis be, and then check out the potential responses in the video's description below. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.